Hello, everyone. Sally again from Striving. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today on another great webinar we have around leadership in a hybrid world. Obviously, a really big hot topic at the moment, with many of us globally moving into a hybrid model and many leaders needing to find some new tips, tricks, ways of working, and relearning how we can all perform and be sort of capable and enhance what we do as individuals and as an organisation in a hybrid world. We have a wonderful host today. We would like lovely Cam Cran from the team space. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Cam, and thank you so much for hosting. We do have Q&A today, just for a little bit of housekeeping. So please, if you do have any questions, drop them in the comments section. They'll come up and we'll be able to answer those as we either go along, but we'll also leave time at the end. So please don't hold on to your questions. Drop them in there so we can see them coming through. And that will also help us with our conversations and sharing any sort of information you'd like to know as well. Over to you, Cam.
Thank you, Sally. Good morning or good afternoon now, everyone, depending on where you are. Thanks for the intro, Sally. Yeah, I thought I would just expand on that slightly. As Sally said, my name's Cam, or Cameron, but Cam's fine. And I have a business called the Team Space, which I started really after a corporate career of always juggling, that battle between the BAU and also making the time and space to work on ourselves as leaders, help teams work on themselves as teams. And I guess that's very much why I'm incredibly interested in this topic today. There wouldn't be a day that goes by where I'm not having this sort of conversation with my clients. Hybrid leadership. I think it's an interesting question because my focus is very much about leadership, regardless of, where that is. And I think both our panel speakers here today are coming at it from the perspective specifically around hybrid. So I will introduce them shortly, but I guess I would set the scene by saying I think this whole area of hybrid has really forced the issue of leadership and what good leadership looks like for many people. In 2020, I started my business actually at the start of 2020, and I did a big research project with a collaborator around the teams that were thriving through that big shift to working from home. And we found a list of key attributes about the teams that were actually surviving in that period. And the ones that had done work on themselves as a team, that was actually part of their culture, that they actually focused on themselves as a team and how they worked together and behaviours and psychological safety and deep connections. Those teams, they didn't sail into working from home, let's be honest, no one did. But they were doing a much better job of it. They found that transition much more manageable. And I think what hybrid has done and is doing is it's pulling out these issues around trust, both from the organisational side and then from the team members' side. I'm sure everyone's hearing as many positive stories as I am, and I'm hearing just as many, dubious ones. The fact is that it's a very live conversation and will continue to be, as it should be. And I think that's important to point out, actually, is that the workplace status quo in terms of, the whole 9 to 5 in the office 5 days a week thing had not been challenged or changed for an, ridiculously long time. And it was very, it was inhospitable to many. And this is a huge opportunity in front of us to take an ongoing iterative approach to what good, healthy workplaces look like for people, so that adaptation and experimentation becomes the norm. And I think one of the things that worries me at the moment is I see some headlines in certain newspapers around, bosses forcing people back to the office. And I think those quite sort of reductive headlines are unhelpful because, as we know, that you see the blunt instrument of media coverage and some people take it to be read. So I would always encourage people, if you see those headlines, read the article and look further and look deeper for any data that's actually supporting it. So I will, having set that scene, hopefully introduce our wonderful speakers today, or wonderful panel. So first of all, Venetia Rathod who I can see down there. V, I think we're going to call you. Venetia is currently a partner at Think and Grow. She's a venture advisor to the startup and scale-up community in Australia. Her expertise lies in sustainable growth through data-driven insights and high-quality talent. In her previous life, she worked in consulting in both Boston Consulting Group and EY, in all things people, culture, strategy, and organisational design. She's also worked on political social media campaigns and recognition of prior learning programs. She said to me, you'll often see me with my briefcase, which holds the secrets to scaling sustainably. She's a really active member of the startup community and is often career coaching, hosting, or speaking at events, particularly those focused on diversity, equality, and inclusion. She's also got a very keen interest in digital health and is inspired to create her own product within the mental health space. So welcome, V. Thank you for being with us this morning or this afternoon. SIG, with almost 20 years experience across tech, not-for-profit and management consulting, Siganda, or SIG, partners with leaders worldwide to drive systemic change towards diversity, equity and inclusion. Using evidence-based science with business acumen, she helps cultivate cultures of wellbeing, inclusion and peak performance. And with her business, Inkling, she is driving the D&I practice and is a sought-after leadership coach, strategic advisor and speaker, empowering organisations to view diversity, equity and inclusion as a business strategy, not just a social responsibility, which is a great place to start today. So, welcome, everyone. I'm going to actually just throw to V for a moment to give a quick overview of your take on this conversation before we get into some specific questions, and then I'll do the same with you, Sig.
Yeah, I always find setting the scene is really important in language. So that's what we were discussing before. So what does hybrid leadership mean? Because I've, in consulting, kind of always worked in outcomes-based, where we were working from home and working more flexibly. So when I was at EY and Boston Consulting Group during when COVID hit, we were actually seen as a go-to for a lot of companies that did not know how to operate with outcomes-based, where the default was in the office, where the default was to work that one way, and I see you, you're working way. And whereas we didn't have that kind of way of operating. So I've kind of worked across that. So I think it's really interesting now when I see trends like empathy is trending, like putting yourself in another person's shoes. And I just roll my eyes to say, how have people succeeded without empathy? Just blows my mind because we were forced to. And now I'm seeing a lot of companies having to step up, because with all the career coaching I'm doing, people are like, I want to work in a good place. And I think that's the default. And remote is, or hybrid is no longer a perk. It's an expectation. And if you want to keep good people, that's the way you have to keep going. So companies are kind of forced to adapt if they want to keep great people to change. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah. Thanks, V. Sig.
Yeah, such a great, I think, context to this conversation as well. And B, as you were talking, I was like, oh, I remember that world well. So ex-PwC here, but I was there before the remote working hybrid conversation started. So it was a very different world back then. And I think, just extending on what you're saying as well, is what we're seeing now is particularly as we're looking to, think about talent, attract talent, the new generation, all of that. But the conversations that we're having now, and we're forced to have since COVID kind of created this blur between work and life anyway, is so much more beyond, I guess, the transactional nature of what work used to be anyway. So where I see hybrid leadership is like, well, yes, it's this focus on empathy, and I don't know if it's a trend. It's like you said, V, it's like, where was this before? But it's such a interesting conversation to have around what does leadership mean, and in the work that we do and the conversations we have with organizations and leaders, is actually that bigger focus on diversity, equity and inclusion, particularly inclusion. And we talk about inclusive leadership being the leadership of the 21st century in order to be able to manage this new normal, quotation marks, I'm going to say that a few times, but also really thinking about people beyond their roles and actual humans, right? as well. So I think it's a great conversation to have. We're all learning as we go along as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you. I mean, I've been fascinated by the leadership space for, probably the best part of 20 years. And for me, searching for good leadership, it's about the principles of good leadership. And I don't think they differ. It's just that now that people actually have to really embrace the idea of working on themselves as leaders, because the environment's changed so much, and they can't just rely on, seeing people and talking to people and that whole ad hoc approach. They have to get much more deliberate and intentional about it. All right, let's go to our first question. So, V, I'll start with you. And it's a question to both of you. So, V, if I throw it to you first, how is your business embracing hybrid work and hybrid leadership?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. There's about 22 of us globally. And as you can see, the office is nice and empty. There's my one colleague over there. So there's about 5 of us in the Sydney office and about 6 in Melbourne and then over in the UK and in Singapore. It's been really interesting because I've actually been on both sides. So I've been in the head office and I've also been a satellite. With Boston Consulting Group, I was in a global team, and Australia was kind of the neglected little tiny office and not in the main, so the contrasting view has been really, really interesting. How we've embraced it. I think what I found really interesting is when we were moving offices to this one, and I do shout out to my co-founder on that, I listened to this thing that said that the office is just as intentional as a tool that you buy. And so the office no longer seen as the default place to go, but actually, is it a place that you want to create where people create memories or work together or create that ambience of what kind of workplace you want to create? So we're in the startup tech community. We have a bar downstairs that was already there. And that's a place that together, we're not always at the bar, just letting everyone know. We are separate. But it's when he was creating the office, he got us all in. He said, how far is the commute from your current place to this office, which I've never seen really leaders do before. And then when we were designing it, he got the designer in and was like, how do you want it to be? So that was really cool. Other ways we've really embraced it is getting the whole team together across the globe. So we used to do weekly connects, but just with the Australian office. And I think it was very felt that we weren't connecting with the wider group. So now we meet Monday afternoons, which, wasn't what we did before. But the feedback is that communication, and consistency across everywhere. And so some people didn't feel left out, but it was just that kind of thing. So that's been really interesting. With the hybrid working, that's also been, we're all adults in this company. So I guess it's very dependent on the company that you work with. So there's not many of us. The vibe is very much in the office, but there's also really an understanding and respect and trust that you'll get whatever you need to get done within the hours. And I think I've been very inbuilt. Like if I don't work my 40 hours minimum, there is such guilt, but it's also like that there's an integrity to it as well. So if I don't do something in that time, I'll make it up on a Sunday night. So I think having the trust is really important because that's how I operate, but it's also the behaviors that are expected in a company. So, I mean, I don't know if that helps answers it, but there's quite a few little things that we do here to kind of get that way of working.
Thanks, Faye. Sig, what about you? How are you embracing it?
Yeah, it's such a pertinent question, and one that we at Inkling actually just had quite recently at our recent strategy day, only a couple of months ago, actually. As we're probably a similar size to Think and Grow in terms of company size, and head office is Sydney based. I'm in Melbourne, so I'm the satellite here as well. So when we were having that conversation a few months ago, being who we are at Inkling, we take that very evidence-based approach. So it was like, what does the research say, right, around this? And what are the things that we actually need to consider as we are, well, one, we've grown as an organization. We had also moved offices as well recently in our Sydney office. And then how does that actually look like in terms of both the core team that are Sydney based, but then all of us that are not necessarily there all the time. And, through, and so the first thing was that we as a company, so at our strategy day, we actually had it as a whole company conversation around what does hybrid working and ways of working actually look like to us. And it's so interesting because, personally, I've been working hybrid probably for the last 7 years, even beyond the pandemic. So when I left management consulting, I started my own business and I was working from home. And then when I intentionally came back to employment, it was very much had to be flexible working, part-time, something I cared about, and allowing me to use my skills. And I was very fortunate to have a place where I could come in 1 day a week. I was 3 days. I could bring my kids to work. I could bring my pets to work. If I was in the office, I could sit in the park because the Wi-Fi extended over. And those kind of thinking, brought into the conversation. So at Inkling, we talked about a few things. So as a whole thing, and one was really understanding like what is everyone's roles and the type of work that we do. And so this very intentional understanding of everyone's needs from a working style, the roles that they play within the organization. So we have a delivery team, we have a project management team, and then we have our sort of, our operational team as well. And what we came to understand from the research, this sort of 4 types of work that really can be, categorized into. So really thinking about kind of energy do you need, kind of focus do you need, what's the work that you need, collaboration or cooperation, and then understanding how does that work for you. So for me in particular, so I have ADHD, which means that by the afternoon, when my meds wear off, I'm useless. I'm pretty useless. So what that's meant for me is I front end all my client meetings in the morning when my mind's working. It allows me to get all the stuff out of the way, and I've intentionally created the afternoons for the work that I need deep focus, and I don't need to talk to anyone, and I can put my head down and just do it that way. So understanding ways of working, the 4 types of things, and then what we came up with was really understanding what does that look like from a team perspective and an organization perspective, and how does our culture actually drive some of this. And so what we came up with was our concept called guilt-free flexibility, which means that, like V, it's very outcome-based. So it's not necessarily that you have to work your 40 hours a week. In the sense, it's as long as the work gets done, and there's no guilt to be taken if you have to go to your kid's parent-teacher interview or take time off, or you've got something on, you want to take a class or whatever it is, knowing that you can maybe make that up a little bit later. And what we've done around this is created, I guess, what we call digital guardrails. So, for example, I pick my kids up from school. I'm going to be with them for a couple of hours in the afternoon, which means that if I'm not finished my work, I might log back on in the evening. But if I'm sending out emails, we've got guardrails to say, don't send me an email at 10 p.m., schedule it for the morning. So there's not that obligation to check your email, even if you might be working. And we talked about like synchronous and asynchronous time, and really challenging, what does work look like? Does it have to be bound to time? Does it have to be bound to place? And then, like V said, intentionally thinking about the space. And I think that's the biggest thing we need to think about, is considering remote to almost be the default way of working, but really intentionally thinking about what is going to be the connection points and the reasons for people to come together, to connect, to collaborate, and have a space that really fosters that collaboration and that environment. So we've got team days, both virtually and in person, that we do. Here in Melbourne will be me and my one colleague here in Melbourne. We're going to be starting at a co-working space in the next couple of weeks, so we can come and connect. And we've got anchor days for us to do that. And then the rest of the week we work how we need to within our own deliverables. So that's just some of the things that we're doing. And I think it's still a work in progress. But I guess out of that was really understanding our culture, our values, our ways of working, and then coming together to have a conversation around it before making decisions. Yeah.
Thanks, Sig. A couple of things that both of you mentioned that I really like, and I include them in my you know principles of leadership, and one of them is around the co-creation. So you talked about having a conversation, and V, you talked about coming together consistently. And I think, you cannot rely on one person at the top or an executive team to, create something that's going to work for everyone. And I understand firsthand the power of people co-creating and being involved in that process. And the other thing I think you both were alluding to, I like to call it, how do you cultivate a culture of responsibility? So, and it's you could call it ownership mindset, collective accountability. I really like the word responsibility, because I think it's more driven from inside individuals as opposed to accountability, which can often be sort of held over people. But I think you both talked about that, it's based on trust. So how do you build that, and I think that leads nicely into our next question, which is, what are the specific leadership skills perhaps that you've had to develop, or changes that you've perhaps had to make to your leadership style, so it works across the office, whether it's, virtual or in person? B?
I would say communication. So distributed teams require more effort on communication. So I think a thing that I'm learning is, so for example, we've just launched a compensation unit RAM benchmarking tool for Australia that went live yesterday. So I've been working with the founders behind the scene. Yeah, thank God. That's a tool from Israel that we've helped on the go-to-market here. And so that was launched yesterday. But, the team don't know all the nuances that go behind the scenes and what's involved. And it's going live and there's a LinkedIn update, but the team don't know about it. And so if people are coming up to them going, you just launched this thing, what are the details? They're like, we don't know. We don't get any internal. We just see it when it's external. I know it happens a lot. And so being so cognizant of that, posted just internally, just on our Slack channel just before, just to say, hey, this is it. And they're doing a showcase next week, because people keep asking me questions. And I said, just sign on to the showcase that we normally show our customers. Here you go. Like, it's there, it's informed. Other things we've been doing is, as you know, when you work with different teams, you have different time zones. So our content person's based in London, and she's like, Manisha, these are the days I work. Because, we all messaging each other at odd times. And it's to put those reminders in my calendar to say, oh, yeah, she works these 2 days, half day. She's like, I'm going to get better at boundaries, because, we're all humans. And if you hire people that love to help and love to give, as same as that, you could always cross that. So it's just knowing and having those expectations and deadlines. So just knowing how people operate and work. So I think for me, it's visibility is a very big thing. Just being across and communicative, and just saying, if I don't know something, just be really open. Like, I don't know at the moment, but these are the steps we're taking to work towards that. So that's a really, really big one. And I guess we just get caught up in our own bubbles so much that we don't realize the impact of what we do has on others. So I'm being really cognizant of that. And even as I know the founders are running around so much, so I'd communicate on behalf of them. This is happening, blah for this. We need you for this. Yep. Sometimes, like, I organize our events, and I do everything apart from the recruiting. So that's where I'll be involved in. So then I'm organizing the events, and they're like, we don't know that this is happening. And I'm like, we're really sorry. We're going to get better at it. And it's that inclusive bit. Another thing I've really adjusted is we have a team in Singapore. So being really mindful of opportunities that can also assist them, because they're not in the office. They're not what they see. They're not in the head office. You've got the satellite versus the head. It's also being really cognizant. Is there opportunities to get them involved in things? And that's not just on the leaders to do that, but that's throughout the team. Oh, I know there's a company that's expanding here or looking to support here. Let me connect you with blah. So my natural inclination is to connect, but it's to know that we're working as one kind of team. If there's anything that's good news to share, it should be shared throughout. So that's something I'm being really mindful of. And obviously, if there's anything that's really fun to share, joyous, like that creates that bit of warmth. That's how I'm orientated anyway. But I think everyone kind of plays mini roles, especially in smaller companies, with that kind of stuff. But I also work with, we also consult with other companies, and I look a lot at scalability. So what can be done when you have 20 is very different with 100, 150, 2,000, right? And whenever I do big change programs, I always say that people always want to hear from their direct manager and from their CEO. they don't want to hear from a consultant that's doing the change work. They want to hear from the people on the ground. So it's being really cognizant. Are your managers on the pulse with the people they're working with? Do they know what their overall career ambitions are? Do they know where they're at? Are there going to be any surprises if they have a review and they're not getting, an increase, or if they're being let go or something's happening? It's like, what's the responsibility of the managers and the CEO and the groups in helping companies and people progress? So I think it's all that kind of stuff. It is, like you say, Sig, the whole human element of work. But what I'm also being really mindful of, and I see a lot happen, especially with young people. Have you seen this live quitting? I only found this out at the dentist yesterday. I don't watch TV, but I was getting my teeth done, and I was like, what is live quitting? And it's this trend on TikTok, which I don't have, showing my age, and people too scared to quit, so they quit on social media live. Detrimental to their career. I could not think of a more stupid thing to do. But it is at the state where, do they feel so unsafe, or they are that scared that they don't want to confront things? And if you have a company like that, like, obviously there's something internal, but it's also something with the company to go, why is it like that? Why do they feel that unsafe that they would rather do that than just talk about it and go, look, if that's not for you, let me help you with something else. Like, this
and
is
I think from everything that you're saying, V, is it really just supports coming back to leadership. Regardless, like the principles of leadership. How do you make people feel safe? How do you make people want to be responsible for their own development, their own careers? How do you make them feel supported? For me, it's regardless of where you're working. It makes it harder, when you've got a distributed workforce, because it's everyone's incredibly busy, and so we get stuck in the weeds of the doing. And again, it's finding that space to get up on the balcony and have a look at what's going on systemically for the team and the organisation. Sig, what about you? What changes have you had to implement in terms of your own leadership style?
Oh, yeah. I'll get to that. I wanted to come back to this live quitting thing, because I was like, well, the quality of the TV shows at the dentist is questionable, but look, it's an interesting concept, right? And I was thinking about it as you were saying, and I think you nailed it on the head in terms of the safety aspect, right? The psychological safety. And I think also sometimes the reality is potentially that if there isn't that environment of psychological safety where they've either had felt like they could have those conversations with their direct managers or within the organization, that they've taken to social media to publicly keep the organization accountable, because there's nothing like brand reputation to go, oh, what's going on here, right? So I'm not sure if I agree with the method, but I would say that as an extreme kind of form or a result of having a lack of psychological safety within an organization. And for me, I think then it's just thinking about is, and the same, V, as you're talking about, is when we work with organizations that, to the thousands of employee and globally, is like, how do we capture what we do here at Inkling and do that at scale? Because I think firstly, understanding that sometimes your in-person leadership style may not directly translate to the virtual world and vice versa as well. And so someone who's really good at, say, the one-on-one, conversations might really struggle to maintain that same level of connection in virtually as well, because there are so many competing priorities and distractions. And as you get into those weeds, it's really easy to, get lost in there and not have that balcony time to understand how your leadership is actually going. So for me, I think where I've actually thought about how it's changed is probably just doubling down and a deeper focus on psychological safety, connection and well-being, and that accountability piece, which actually is around psychological safety, because it's not just saying that we all feel safe enough to speak up, right, when things are going wrong, but it is the accountability piece, that we're all got this motivation and this collective motivation to want to do things better for this organization. And you need both safety and accountability in order for your company to be able to be, try new things, be innovative, to fail forward and to make mistakes and learn from them. So doubling down to psych safety has probably been one of the biggest things I've done. And that means being vulnerable and being honest and having those conversations about, I guess, the stresses within an organization. And so for me, like I said, I've had really transparent conversations around my ADHD, which how it shows up. And I guess more importantly, asking for what I need in order to set myself up, and by default, then my team and the rest of the organization up for success. So there is that accountability piece and responsibility piece in order to move forward. But going, hey, I actually need a little bit of help here. I get some help around this as well. And that you requires a really high level of trust and psych safety for someone to disclose that one and for ask for help, because people, like you said, are naturally really good at giving help. We all want to help. We all want to do our best. But if you can't ask for help in the same way you can give help, there's a lack of trust within that relationship, I would say. I think boundaries and role modeling boundaries is really important from a well-being perspective. And I think that's a huge part of hybrid leadership that we really need to bring into the conversation around productivity, but also engagement and performance and culture and the whole holistic person, right? And what we do at Inkling from a, in our professional well-being practice is really centering well-being and really thinking about the individual as a person, not just a resource. And so that's keeping in mind that they've got a life outside of the box we might see, or the person we might see in the office. And so that guilt-free flexibility comes into here. I would say boundaries is something I'm still working on, like, to be really honest, because I love what I do. And when I get into hyper-focus mode as well, because that's a symptom of ADHD, when you get into the flow, like, you can stop, you can go for hours, right? So I've had leaders actually in my organization come up to me and go, "See, you're working too much," or "Take a break," or whatever it is that you need. When I'm like, yes, I'll, when I say yes to a lot of things because I love what I do. And I think the last thing is, I love the communication. I think you almost have to over communicate. But the other thing that I've also had to potentially change in my leadership is being more patient and understanding. And that's not something that naturally comes to me as well, especially if you're living with small humans where your patience is like this already. So that patience and understanding and coming back to really valuing that person as a whole person, not just as a transactional relationship where they're doing a piece of work for you or how they fit in with your role, is something that, I've had to really intentionally work on, because I've been in organizations smaller than what we are where it has been like that. And some of those sort of behaviors you have to really intentionally kind of unlearn in order to be able to create better, more productive behaviors as well. Yeah.
I think you touch on a really important point, Sig, which is that getting to know each other on a much deeper level allows us as teams to be so much more effective and cohesive, because we know those things about each other. And I'm not necessarily talking about the personal backstories, but just, as you say, the things about our work styles. I also have ADHD, and I know I get in flow in the evenings, and it drives my partner crazy because I'm tapping away. And it's like, that's when I'm going to do my best work. And I'm really sorry, but I can't do anything else right now. And I miss working in teams, but because I work for myself. But it's those sorts of conversations. So that, there's a responsibility on the individual to say what they need. But it's that I need this in order to be my best. And I think it's hard if people haven't seen that sort of thing role modeled by their leaders.
Yeah.
Because I talk about psychological safety being an environment of rewarded vulnerability. And vulnerability is not, it's not the disclosure piece. It's saying I need help, or I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll go and find out. Or I'd like to learn something new because I don't feel I know about it, or I fucked this up. Sorry, excuse my language. And that being okay. So that role modeling piece is so incredibly important.
And Cam, if I can just add to that is, and I think that goes to V's point before, is that we know from the research, and actually I just went to a conference recently around workplace wellbeing and similar stats, but the one that we do in D&I particularly is around, 70% of an employee's experience of inclusion is influenced by their direct manager, right? And on the same level, it's a similar stat, something like 70% of an employee's mental health and well-being is directly influenced by their relationship with their direct manager, which is actually on par to the same influence that their partner has on them at home. So if you can imagine how much, if you're partnered, if you have someone at home, and how much they influence your mental health and your well-being, your direct manager and their relationship also has the same influence on you. So as leaders, it's like, oh my gosh, now we've got to think about all of this stuff on top of all this, other management things that we only had to think about. And it's just a conversation we've only started doing in the last, 5, maybe 7 years. But it is taking that very intentional step to get to know the people that you are working for and with, and understanding them. And you don't have to know everything about them. You can understand their strengths, and that would be enough to really support ways of working that is, productive and works with the culture you're trying to create.
I think it's the intentional interpersonal curiosity. So no, you can't be expected to know everything, right? But if you keep seeking to understand before seeking to be understood, that's a great place to start. I don't think we can talk about psychological safety enough. I think it is absolutely the key, and I don't think people. Some people will do certain behaviours that, just intuitively, they'll just do it because that's how they're wired, and there are certain behaviours that create psychological safety. And then there are others that they have learned to do deliberately. And then there's a whole lot more that they don't realise that they're doing that actually diminish psychological safety. It's very delicate. It's very dynamic. I honestly don't think we can talk about it enough. Vee, you look like you're about to say something.
I was going to say, my thing is this. What I challenge with all this, with psychological safety, is that self-responsibility. We're seeing now more of a trend of people putting a lot of pressure for their manager to be their be-all, end-all, and their work to be their be-all, end-all. And I'm seeing that there's a lot of self-responsibility too. So I go to therapy, human behavior coach, like all the health. I do all the health, like physical, mental, emotional, all of it, because I don't expect my manager always to have the skills to as well. And I think there's a lot of people who are going through a lot who also need to take the accountability for themselves on what they can manage, and not just on their managers. And I'm seeing this more and more as I've been in the workforce for quite a while. And it's also going, oh, leadership is great, safety is great, but also, when do you know this is a me thing to deal with? This is a professional workplace. And one of the things I really hate, and I used to say it myself, is the word family at work. Like you're a sports team. You're not a family.
Dysfunctional, right? As well.
Families can't stand if you have to get let go, because you never let go of your family, bound by blood, even if you like them or not. But a sports team has an understanding that you're working towards a goal. It still has the same principles of camaraderie, understanding strengths, weaknesses, backing each other up, but not the same thing as family. So when I address people, I say, hey, team, because you're a sports team. You are faster and stronger together than you are on your own. And a family has all kinds of functions. So it's also knowing that work is a place of business, and that you don't always have to have your best friends there. You don't have to have the leader that will be someone you go to your future baby shower if you want to get. Like, it's also understanding as a leader where your role is, the accountability piece, the behavior piece. So when I work with companies, culture is a word I feel gets misconstrued like a lot of other words, and can be meaning a lot of things. So for me, culture, I look at behaviors. So it's not the pizza on a Thursday night. It is I break it down by what are the behaviors you ignore, punish, and reward. If you ignore a behavior, you're accepting a behavior. So if people are not performing to their best, or doing those, 40 hours, if that's what they're paid for, within the week, it doesn't have to be on that certain time scale, but they're not doing that, and they're not being held accountable to not doing that, then you're accepting that behavior, accepting that laziness, because you don't want to have those tough conversations. And now what I'm seeing in startup world more than ever is those cowboy days are over. That rigor, I would say the glitter now needs rigor, and you're now holding people accountable to do their job because money's not free anymore. So it's like, I find that really interesting. And so moving from a corporate to now startups and now saying, well, now you got to make people like literally do their job. And if they're not doing it, how are you addressing it to get what you need? And that's where that leadership comes in. And I find those conversations really interesting because we just don't have that same room anymore.
Yeah. And I have to agree with you, V, there as well. And I think maybe just to further expand on that, it's not really asking leaders to be the be all and end all, because often then they end up being the accidental counselors, right? And you can't expect that from a leader. And what we see is actually supporting leaders with the education, awareness, and capability building of what are the red flags to look out for, so they can have the conversations, but not be the ones that have to deal with it, so they can, support their team and direct reports to go, hey, I think this is something that you need to actually do. But I take your point around that is that, there's a lot of pressure on leaders, but without that expectation that everything is here at work as well. But the point I'm trying to make is that whatever happens in someone's life is still going to affect their work and vice versa. But to your other point around, particularly in tech, and I don't know if you saw this recently, what Atlassian and Canva are doing in terms of their performance management at the moment, is both of them Australian big tech companies. Canva very famously didn't let anyone go off in their big tech layoffs, but what they're actually now starting to do is quite a rigorous performance management process to really understand, what's happening, where is the performance lagging, and I think that's great because it brings that a rigor and accountability back in. And if we go back to culture, those behaviors, like you said, V, what do you ignore, reward, and what was the other one there? Sorry.
Ignore, reward, and punish.
Punish, sorry. If they are set up really well, then this is a process that's only going to make the organization so much better. And I see underperformance as a symptom as well, because it's like, what else is going on that is creating this underperformance? Is it the environment? Is it the lack of clarity? Is it lack of resources, systems? Is it management? Is it the person? And then having those really curious, courageous conversations that psychological safety allows you to have if you've got that within your organization. So you're moving together with accountability and motivation towards that shared goal of creating growth in your business as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've both picked up on this whole area of, I call it difficult conversations, which, the teams that I see that are really successful, they've all trained how to have difficult conversations. It doesn't, they've got a completely different mindset about it. They don't even see it as difficult. They see it as productive. It's the opportunity to move something forward. And it's a very deliberate part of their cultural behavioural strategy that they use. Sally, you've come back online to give us a wrap up.
Gosh, that's gone quick. So many great insights. Fantastic discussions, ladies. I'm loving it. We do have a couple of questions. Anyone, you've got a few minutes left. Please drop some questions in, or insights, thoughts, feedback. But we do have a great question from the always wonderful Deepak Singh. Thank you for joining us, Deepak. He's loving the conversation as well. So he'd like to know, what are some of the new sort of cool, exciting initiatives that you're seeing coming up that are encouraging more of an inclusive leadership and teams in that sort of hybrid world? Anything that's sort of piquing your interest at the moment that you'd like to sort of trial, or anything new that you're trying yourselves at the moment?
I'll just have a really simple one, just having visibility in everyone's diary. I know it sounds really simple, but you can just book stuff and get stuff done. And if anything's private, just put it on private. Like, I cannot tell you how much easier it is for me to get stuff done now, because I've got that visibility across and can access anyone's diary to book things in. It is just removing as many bottlenecks to get stuff done.
I think. I agree with that. That's there. But I think some of the case studies that we had a look at was like Fujitsu is an organization that's actually doing some cool things around space. So rather than saying it's an option between, say, home and the office, we're creating an ecosystem of space depending on how you want to work. So, which could include like co-working spaces, office, at home. So just depending on the type of work and the person's needs. So I think I really like this concept of space. And, if we take a step back and think about it more holistically and what we're doing within our cities and creating communities, it's about how do we start to reimagine space a little bit differently. And there's a great app. I don't know what it might be in Sydney too, but definitely in Melbourne. It's called Third Space, I think it is, where it started over COVID, but essentially you can go on it and it's a membership, but you can find like restaurants, cafes, libraries that will allow you to work from there. And you can, like, you just got to buy a coffee or something and you can hang out, right? So it's how do you start to using existing spaces for working in a way that is a little bit different to a traditional type of office or your home office as well. So yeah, I do like this concept of space.
One of the things that I have seen in quite a large consulting firm, not a big four, not that size, is their policy, which is, people they don't have a policy about where you work. It's driven by 3 considerations, which is what's good for your colleagues, what's good for your clients, and what's good for your career. And I mean, I think the career one can be a bit loaded. However, it's really working for them because they do have a very high trust culture. They've got a very intentional CEO who's sort of set the bar around, around really obvious behaviours that cultivate that sort of environment. So.
Yeah, and I just add to there. Sorry, we're working with one company who was quite hybrid, and now they're seeing the impact on them to have a launch, which is actually quite critical in the absence of not being around together when you're creating it. So it's actually going like the intentional. If it's better for all of you to be in a room, then mandate that 3 days a week. And if they can't live up to it, that's okay. You've had that conversation, they can choose, because the absence of that is actually delaying a lot of things. And because you're tiptoeing to try and be nice, you're not able to fulfill your mission. And so I really say to companies, know what kind of group you're having, know what kind of workforce you're dealing with, know what your product or your services, whether, like you were saying before, Seg, do you need to be together in the room? Is that L&D opportunity? But even if you all need to be in the office and you don't have that hybrid flexibility, make that clear. Because this whole thing of trying to adapt to be hybrid, to be like everyone else, if it compromises you to deliver, is also really screwing up people because they don't want to have those hard things or lose good people. But I'm like, you're not able to fulfill your mission, you will not get funding again. I'm sorry. Like, sometimes you have to draw the line. If it's
right,
then but then that's clear.
The bravery and the being courageous and experimenting with different things. I mean, one of the things we haven't even been able to talk about today, and there's a whole other webinar on this, is how do you manage learning in a hybrid world? Because we just don't have the same volume and degree and opportunity to learn by osmosis, which I think is very challenging for people coming into the workforce for the first time, and very challenging for people building their careers.
We'll add that to the list for another whole webinar.
It's a great question, and I guess I'd just wrap up by saying, and probably maybe echoing what we've all been trying to say, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to hybrid working and the kind of leadership that you need. That's going to depend on the organization, the culture, the mission, the values, the goals, all of that. And it's just about finding what's working for you and just being really adaptable to trying something. And then if it's not working, reassessing it, revisiting it. But I do think, just some of the things that we've talked about really underpinning it and that foundation of inclusion and psychological safety, I think that just stands, no matter what you decide in terms of the mechanism, being able to have safety to be able to speak up and to challenge and have disagreement and to have difficult conversations, and be driven by values and purpose. I think that's always going to be there no matter what.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well said. Well, thank you,
Sally. I just wanted to thank V and Sig. Obviously, there's a lot of practical stuff that's come through today. I hope everyone's been taking lots of notes. I know I have. And certainly, you know, I know Sig and V, and of course myself, we're happy to, you know, take any questions from people offline or via LinkedIn at a later date if you didn't get to them today. Thank you. Back to you, Sally.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you for being an amazing host, ladies. Sig and V, thank you for all of your amazing insights and your knowledge and sharing so fluidly today. Wonderful conversations, great takeaways. Fantastic all-round webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a fantastic rest of your week.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.
Bye.